I came here to die. According to the law, I have been sentenced to death, and so I will not say anything against it. I have not come here to accuse anyone, or to talk about being accused and sentenced to death, but I pray for the king that God will preserve him and allow him to rule long in this kingdom, for he is the best and most gracious king we have had. He has always been a gentle and just Lord to me. And if anyone wishes to judge me, let him judge me favorably. And so I leave this world and you, heartily desiring that you all pray for me. Anne Boleyn said her last words in tears. The court lady blindfolded Anne, and she obediently, though not without fear, laid her head on the scaffold. The executioner demanded his sword. Intuitively, Anne turned in the direction from which the sword was to be brought, and at that moment, using a distraction, the executioner drew the sword lying under the hay and accomplished his mission. Perhaps even after all these years, the story of Anne, the second wife of King Henry VIII, is one of the most tragic and unfortunate in history. The exact date of Anne Boleyn's birth is unknown. She was born in 1501 or 1507. Documents from 1514 mention that Anne was 15 years old at the time, although there are reports that she was younger. The memoirs of Jane Dormer, who was born only 2 years after Anne Boleyn's death, indicate that Anne was born in 1507. Jane Dormer was a lady at Mary Tudor's court and socialized with people who knew both Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn herself well. Mary Tudor, daughter of the unfortunate Catherine of Aragon, was well aware of the biography of her mother's rival. Jane Dormer claimed that Henry VIII's second wife was under 29 at the time of her death, confirming 1507 as the year of Anne's birth. Her portrait in the Boleyn family's estate, Bleakling Hall, bears the Latin inscription Anna Boleyna 1507, meaning Anne Boleyn was born there in 1507. The year 1507 is also indicated by the author of the biography of her daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, William Camden, who lived in the late 16th and early 17th centuries and had access to various documents that have not survived to this day. There is, however, much solid evidence that Anne was born in 1501. For example, her letter to her father in 1514, the handwriting of which corresponded to a 13-year-old young girl, not a 7-year-old child. In addition, in 1513, Anne became a maid of honor to Margaret of Austria, and the minimum age to serve as a maid of honor was 12. However, Margaret of Austria referred to Anne as Little Boleyn, which could be due to the fact that she was not even 12 years old. The date of Anne's birth is important to historians, because if she was 35 at the time of her death, the king could have sent his wife to the scaffold also because of her age and the low probability that Anne could become pregnant again. And Henry VIII maniacally desired a son, the rightful heir to the throne. In 1526, Henry noticed a playful person who was surrounded by men. It was not love at first sight. The king had seen Anne at court before, but she did not strike him as a beauty. Despite the fact that after her death, Henry carefully destroyed all her belongings, there are stories of what Anne Boleyn looked like. She was thin, with olive skin and dark hair. She was far from the canons of beauty of the English lady of the 16th century. Far more attractive was her sister Mary. Mary Boleyn reigned in the king's alcove from 1521 to 1526. Unlike her sister, Mary had milky, fair skin, a mop of blonde wavy hair, and a more well-fed physique. From this relationship, it is likely that Maria gave birth to 2 children. Anne, Mary, and their brother George came from a noble family. Elizabeth Howard, their mother, carried her noble lineage from King Edward I and his second wife, Margaret of France. On her father's side, however, the Boleyn family lineage was not so noble. Anne Boleyn's paternal great-grandfather, Geoffrey Boleyn, was far from noble blood, although he made a decent fortune. Thanks to this, he was able to afford the purchase of Bleakling Hall in Norfolk and Hever Castle in Kent, where Anne Boleyn spent her youth. The widowed Geoffrey married a second time very successfully. His bride was the daughter of Lord Hastings. William Boleyn, the son from this union, entered into an even more favorable marriage to Lady Margaret Butler, daughter and co-heiress of the 7th Earl of Ormond. William and Margaret's son Thomas married the eldest daughter of the 2nd Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth, who was of royal descent. The position of the family of Thomas Boleyn was so strong that neither the bride herself nor her relatives did not even think of refusing a favorable marriage because of the merchant origin of the groom. Thomas Boleyn was an extraordinary man, characterized by great intelligence. He also possessed linguistic abilities which, in turn, allowed him to make a career in diplomacy. Thomas Boleyn was very hard-working and, to the surprise of many, incorruptible, that even his main flaw, stinginess, proved to be an advantage for the work of a member of Parliament. He carried out his missions admirably. From his marriage to Elizabeth, Thomas had 3 children, Mary, Anne, and George. It turned out that his brilliant mind and ability to learn foreign languages inherited the middle daughter, and it was on her parents pinned the greatest hope. Elizabeth and Thomas Boleyn gave both their daughters an appropriate education, typical for women from good families of the time. In addition to learning to read and write, Anne studied arithmetic and knew both the history of her country and of her own family. It is likely that special importance was attached to the royal blood Anna had inherited on her mother's side. Since in the future the girl was to become a model wife and mistress of her husband's estate, her education included domestic skills such as housekeeping and embroidery. In addition, Anne and Mary were taught good manners, dancing, music, and singing, as well as the fashionable social games of cards, dice, and chess. The girls also had to know how to shoot archery, ride a horse, and hunt, including with falcons. I note that Catherine of Aragon, despite her excellent education and great religiosity, was deprived of such skills as dancing, singing, and card games. Henry VIII, on the contrary, loved these things in women. Even when he married Anne of Cleves, the first thing she learned at the English court was to play cards. In 1513, young Anne was sent to Mechlin to become maid of honor at the court of Margaret of Habsburg, Duchess of Savoy, and Governor of the Netherlands. Anne stood out for her impeccable manners, and the Duchess saw fit to thank Thomas Boleyn for her daughter's excellent upbringing. Anne was more ambitious than her older sister. Paradoxically, it was Anne's ambition that took her to the top and caused her subsequent downfall. In the fall of 1514, Anne Boleyn left the court of Margaret of Habsburg and moved to France to the court of Mary Tudor, sister of King Henry VIII. Mary Tudor was to marry King Louis XII. Henry VIII's sister was not too happy about the prospect of marrying the King of France, who to an 18-year-old girl seemed like a decrepit old man. At that time, Louis XII was already 52 years old. In addition, Mary Tudor was secretly in love with the handsome Duke of Suffolk. Fate was favorable to Mary Tudor, freeing her from her unloved husband just 3 months after the wedding. Louis XII died on January 1, 1515, and Mary was able to return to her native country, already in the status of wife of the Duke of Suffolk. Anne Boleyn remained in France as court lady to 15-year-old Claude of France, wife of the new King of France. Anne spent about 7 more years in France, having time to learn the art of flirting, seduction, perfectly learn the French language, absorb the culture and mentality of refined French ladies. Unlike her older sister, Anne Boleyn managed to maintain a good reputation at the French court. It is likely that this is due to the fact that Anne did not fall into the net of the amorous Francis I, and the court of Queen Claude was famous for its strict morals. After Francis spoke unflatteringly of Mary Boleyn, calling her an English mare unworthy of others, Henry VIII decided to find out for himself what exceptional talents Mary was endowed with. But the charm of Anne consisted not so much in beauty, but in personal charm, intelligent conversation, and a sharp mind. Around 1521, Anne's parents called their daughter back to England. It was time for the girl to marry. Anne's planned marriage to Irish aristocrat James Butler was supposed to be a solution to complex inheritance disputes. In the end, the marriage failed, and Anne became the maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. The family life of Catherine and Henry did not go well. The king had favorites, and Catherine proudly bore all the insults of her husband. In the end, no girl, even the most beautiful, could not compete with the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, as well as a native aunt of the emperor. Unfortunately for Catherine, her husband eventually found a woman who was not satisfied with the position of toy of the king. Anne Boleyn was not a beauty, at least according to her contemporaries. The Venetian ambassador who happened to meet her wrote in one of his letters that he was very disappointed that Anne was not one of the most beautiful women in the world and could not understand what Henry VIII saw in her. Anne was the complete opposite of the standard of beauty of the time, a black-eyed brunette with a swarthy complexion. Having seen the beloved of the king, people wrote that her complexion is dark, even earthy. Others thought that she looks like she suffers from jaundice. In the opinion of some, Anna was even more spoiled by her birthmarks. No one liked her wide lips, but all who described Anna unanimously agreed that she had beautifully shaped eyebrows, a long swan neck, and beautiful, unusually black eyes, in which lurked exceptional intelligence. Despite these shortcomings, Anna could not complain about the lack of suitors. Soon, another man, Lord Henry Percy, son of the Earl of Northumberland, won her favor. The Earl was a powerful and wealthy man, referred to by his contemporaries as Henry the Magnificent, and his family held a much higher position than the Boleyn family, descended from a merchant. Anne met Percy at the court of Queen Catherine and fell in love with the handsome young man rather quickly. Percy quickly succumbed to Anne Boleyn's charms. There were rumors that the couple even secretly got engaged, but the wedding did not take place because of the disagreement of the groom's father. Anne was not a suitable match for a descendant of the Earl of Northumberland. Not only that, on her father's side of her family were ancestors from the merchant class, but she was also, in the opinion of the father of Lord Percy, too poor to be a member of his family. However, Anne was waiting for a much more status groom. When the king became infatuated with Anne, he was 34 years old and had already ruled England for 18 years. Henry VIII was still very handsome, although his youthful years were behind him. The king was not yet obese, had a rather athletic physique, and the Venetian ambassador wrote in one of his letters that it would be hard to find a man of taller stature and more noble appearance. Henry fell hard for the charming and playful Anne Boleyn, which was probably a surprise to himself. Clever Anne chose an unexpected tactic towards her admirer. She kept the king at a distance. This was a novelty for Henry. No woman had ever treated him in this way. The king spent huge sums of money on her, showering the lady of his heart with expensive gifts. Henry stopped visiting the queen's bedroom, but at first he did not think of marrying Anne, wanting to make her only an official favorite. To his surprise, the girl refused him, making it clear that he would win her only if he married her. At first, the king did not take it seriously, but in time came to the conclusion that he deserved a second chance for a successful marriage. He was already certain that he would never have children with Catherine of Aragon, and since he considered it his royal duty to the country to have an heir to the throne, he decided to part with his first wife and marry the much younger Anne, who he thought would give him a son. Around the beginning of 1527, Henry promised Anne that he would divorce Catherine and marry her. What Henry actually wanted was not so much to divorce Catherine as to have his marriage to her annulled. The church too often turned a blind eye to such cases by granting annulments, especially in the case of royalty, when important dynastic issues were at stake and, more importantly, the annulment was somehow in the church's interest. Henry's older sister, Margaret Tudor, divorced her second husband. In her rather convoluted petition for an annulment, she claimed that she had married her second husband when her first husband, King James IV of Scotland, was still alive. This was a rather far-fetched justification, for the monarch had been killed at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, a year before Margaret's second marriage. Nevertheless, the divorce was obtained. In Catherine's case, the matter was complicated by the fact that she was a relative of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was not keen on the idea of annulling his aunt's marriage. Henry, in petitioning for the annulment of his marriage, claimed that he had previously gone astray by marrying Catherine, his brother's widow. Forgetting his earlier boast after the wedding night, he now claimed that Catherine had not been innocent at all on their wedding day. The proof of this was a letter from her father Ferdinand, which contained the rather unpleasant suggestion that the relationship between Catherine and Arthur might have been consummated after all. Moreover, Henry believed that the lack of a male heir, the Queen's frequent miscarriages, and the deaths of her newborn children were a clear sign from God that he was mired in a sinful relationship. Henry was convinced that once he was freed from the prison of this sinful marriage and married another woman, God would give him a son. Catherine did not share Henry's viewpoint. She was not convinced by her husband's arguments about his allegedly sinful life. Catherine of Aragon immediately sprang into action. She sent a letter to her nephew, the Emperor, asking him to intervene. Catherine of Aragon asked Charles to personally influence Henry to change his mind. She also asked the Pope to intercede in her favor. In 1527, all of England realized who was really behind the king's decision to reject Catherine. Anne Boleyn settled in the king's court and enjoyed all the privileges due to a queen, but she still did not share a bed with Henry. She put the monarch's patience to a serious test. The king's divorce was dragging on and seemed an almost impossible task. Anne blamed this state of affairs on the king's closest advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who, in her opinion, was not doing enough to fulfill his duties in connection with the divorce case. Meanwhile, the monarch trusted Wolsey as no one else and was firmly convinced that it is thanks to the cardinal will be able to achieve the annulment of his marriage to Catherine. Unfortunately, it was not so simple, and even the almighty Wolsey was difficult to convince the Pope to annul the marriage. All the efforts of Henry's men were in vain, and the divorce eventually failed. Especially Pope Clement V. I was at that time a prisoner of the Emperor. As a result, Henry was forbidden to marry Anne until the decision made in Rome, which angered the king. Anne Boleyn managed to convince the monarch that the cardinal himself was to blame for the delayed procedure. Moreover, according to her, Wolsey deliberately delayed the divorce. This was enough to make the all-powerful cardinal fall into disfavor. In 1529, he was accused of treason and thrown into prison, where he died on November 29, 1530. It became clear to Henry that the Pope would never annul his marriage to Catherine, so he sought other solutions. He read The Obedience of a Christian by William Tyndale, a supporter of the Reformation, which was cleverly offered to him by Anne Boleyn. The author of the publication argued that the king, as God's anointed on earth, could make any decision he pleased, and that even the Pope had no right to impose anything on him. Henceforth, Henry decided to follow the advice in the book and seek a divorce, and then marry the woman he loved. The king challenged the Pope's right to issue a marriage license. In 1531, Henry banished Catherine, and the rooms she occupied were occupied by Anne Boleyn. That same year, the royal advisor and minister who had taken Wolsey's place, Thomas Cromwell, introduced two important laws formally recognizing the monarch as head of the Church of England, which amounted to a break with the Catholic Church. Chancellor Thomas More, known for his strict principles and extraordinary piety, resigned in protest, to which of course Cromwell was nominated. The king's marriage to the unhappy Catherine was immediately annulled. Henry finally regained his freedom and was able to marry his beloved Anne, whom he appointed Marquess of Pembroke on September 1, 1532, making her the most important woman in the royal court. It was a testament to her powerful position that, like a queen, she accepted petitions and granted audiences to foreign ambassadors. Anne's family also benefited from her new status. Her father was made Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond. Her sister Mary received a lavish annual salary from the monarch, and her son was sent to court and placed under Anne's guardianship. Anne's younger brother also benefited greatly from the position his sister held under the king. On October 11, 1532, Anne officially accompanied the king to meet with King Francis I of France, and it was then that she was first formally introduced as the future wife of Henry VIII. The French king, who had known Anne Boleyn while still at his wife's court, was very surprised at such news. Another important event took place in Calais. It was there that the king spent the first night together with Anne. The clever girl knew that the king is already in her hands, and the much-desired marriage is only a matter of time, so she no longer needed to keep him at a distance. Soon the preparations for the wedding gained even more momentum, because in early 1533, it became known that Henry's bride was expecting a child. Both were sure it would be a boy. On January 25, 1533, the ceremony took place, which was held in the strictest secrecy and therefore had a rather modest atmosphere. About this, of course, learned the unfortunate Catherine, to the depths of his soul horrified by the act of the king, who dared to break with the church. She no longer had the right to the title of queen. Henceforth she was only the widow of Prince Arthur of Wales. Charles V's envoy to the English court wrote a letter to the emperor urging him to go to war with England. He claimed that his aunt had been insulted. The envoy claimed that Anne had the worst reputation and people even suspected that she was a witch. In addition, he assured the emperor that in case of war with England, he could count on the favor of Scotland and France would remain neutral. Charles had other problems, however, for the eastern borders of the empire were threatened by the Turks. Henry's subjects, except for a handful of courtiers ready to do anything to flatter the king, were on the side of the offended and abandoned Catherine. June 1, 1533 was a great triumph for Anne, who, already 6 months pregnant, was crowned Queen of England. Henry's wife appeared at the ceremony in a gown of scarlet brocade adorned with precious stones. She wore a necklace of pearls around her neck, and the pearls themselves, as one foreign ambassador scrupulously noted in his report, were larger than a pea. Anne's thick black hair fell down her back. Unfortunately, the ceremony did not delight the English. To Henry, it didn't matter in the slightest. He was happy to marry Anne, making her queen. The new queen's court was much larger than that of her predecessor. It numbered up to 250 people, including more than 60 ladies of the court. The monarch was radiant with happiness and awaited the birth of his son, celebrating at numerous banquets and tournaments. Unfortunately, a bitter disappointment awaited both the king and Anne. Instead of the boy everyone was expecting, on September 7, 1533, the queen gave birth to a healthy and strong girl who was named Elizabeth. The king was upset. After all, Anne was almost certain to give her beloved husband an heir to the throne. Although Anne was disappointed by the birth of the baby girl, she still loved her daughter. Elizabeth was recognized as the king's first legitimate child, which also made Mary, the daughter of Catherine and Henry, illegitimate and stripped her of her rights to the throne. However, this did not mean that the king stopped loving Mary. Henry continued to visit her often, assuring her that she could always count on his care and kindness, which in turn displeased Anne, who was jealous of her husband's daughter. According to rumors, Anne Boleyn threatened to turn Mary into a servant and marry her off to any butler, and before that, a good beating. When news of this reached the public, resentment towards the unloved queen grew. Anne possessed not only a fiery temper but also a foul tongue. It was her harsh remarks that first won her favor with the king, but as time went on, they began to annoy Henry more and more. Anne was not submissive and was always in arguments with the king. Henry's second wife always got her way, and she had the last word. When in 1534 it became known that the queen was pregnant again, there was no limit to the joy. Anne made great efforts to get pregnant as soon as possible, refusing, for example, to breastfeed little Elizabeth, who was given to nannies. When Elizabeth was only 2 months old, Anne became pregnant again. This time everyone was sure that a son would be born. Reconstruction of the chambers at Eltham Palace began. A canopy was placed over the specially ordered cradle, studded with jewels and decorated with Tudor roses. The glazing in his chambers was repaired and the ceiling beams were painted. Children's clothes sewn from expensive fabric and gold-embroidered bedding were also ordered. This time, however, the news that the queen was pregnant was not publicized. Anne still attended balls and revels. However, in the summer of 1534, she suffered a miscarriage. There are reports that a year later she was also pregnant, but she again had a miscarriage. In addition, Catherine of Aragon died on January 7, 1536. The next day, the royal couple appeared at court in yellow robes, a symbol of joy in England, which caused widespread discontent. However, in Spain, where the late queen was from, it was yellow that signified mourning. Anne's miscarriage, recorded in the annals on January 29, 1536, may have been the result of the queen's shock at her husband's accident at the tournament on January 24. The case seemed serious. The king was unconscious for nearly 2 hours. As it happened, the queen lost another child just on the day of the funeral of Henry's previous wife. After another miscarriage, the dream of giving birth to the monarch's desired heir became almost unreal. Dark clouds began to gather over Anne's head, especially as her husband, who had previously looked at her with admiration, began to look at other ladies of the court. In January 1536, the monarch turned his attention to one of the ladies of the court who had previously served Queen Catherine, and after her death became the court lady of Anne. Her appearance matched the ideal beauty of that era, a graceful blonde with an alabaster complexion. This is Jane Seymour, who Henry noticed when his wife lost another child, but according to some sources, the king had been interested in Jane before. While still pregnant, Anne once saw them together in a rather unambiguous situation. Jane was sitting on the king's lap. It is believed that it was the shock of what she saw, rather than an accident with the monarch at a tournament, that caused Anne's subsequent miscarriage. Even earlier, the queen had dismissed from court another young lady in whom the king dared to show interest, which provoked his anger. Jane Seymour had not been disposed of in time, and behind the new candidate for the king's favorite were her two brothers and Cromwell, who was associated with them and did not want to see Anne as queen. Initially, the king planned a short-lived relationship with Jane. It was assumed that Jane Seymour would become his favorite, his new plaything. However, the shrewd Jane, perhaps on the advice of her brothers or the cunning Cromwell, employed a technique similar to that previously used by Anne. When the king's messengers delivered a gift to her, a purse generously filled with money as an advance for Jane Seymour's services in his bedroom, she behaved surprisingly. She fell on her knees before the monarch's envoys and told them that honor was the only thing she would defend, even at the cost of death, and if the king wished to reward her, let him do so after her marriage. Jane's chosen role as a virtuous woman was a great success. This behavior aroused the king's interest and soon developed into love. But Jane herself was the complete opposite of Anne, and not only physically, but also had a completely different character. Although she was not as clever or ambitious as Henry's second wife, what the king had once admired in Anne had now lost its appeal. Henry needed an obedient wife who would not be interested in politics, but would keep house and bear him a son. Meanwhile, Anne interfered too often in affairs of state, and worse, she failed to give the king the desired heir to the throne, becoming an obstacle to the legitimization of his relationship with Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn was not recognized as queen by any European court, and her subjects simply hated her. Therefore, the king wanted to get rid of her as soon as possible, in which he had to help Cromwell. Rumors about the immoral behavior of the queen, for which previously severely punished, revived, but now about her infidelity and propensity for debauchery, no one was punished. Cromwell was most likely behind the spreading of the rumors seeking to ruin Henry's second wife. In time, the king himself listened to the false rumors and began to shun his wife. In April 1536, a musician in the Queen's service was arrested and accused of being in Anne's alcove. The man, of course, denied everything, but the Tower had its own tried and tested ways of getting anyone to confess to anything they were accused of. Another courtier, Sir Henry Norris, was also accused of intimacy with the Queen, but he escaped torture because he came from an aristocratic family. Norris swore by all holiness that Anne had been faithful to her husband. Other men accused of having an affair with the Queen were subsequently imprisoned, including her own brother George, who was accused of having an incestuous affair with his older sister. On May 2, 1536, Anne Boleyn was taken to prison in the Tower. The king spoke openly about the error of divorcing Catherine, believing that Anne had used witchcraft to cloud his mind. On May 12, the four main defendants went on trial, insisting that both they and Anne herself were innocent. Only Smeaton, who had been tortured earlier, pleaded guilty. On May 15, Anne and her younger brother went on trial. The Queen was accused not only of adultery but also of incest, as well as participation in a conspiracy against the king. All of her alleged favorites were also accused of preparing the assassination. It was alleged that Anne not only had an incestuous relationship with her own brother, as her accusers claimed, but also planned to have a son by him. Allegedly, since Anne had failed to conceive an heir with the king, she asked her own brother and several courtiers to help her in this endeavor. Some evidence of an incestuous relationship between Anne and her brother was presented, but it was frankly absurd. Allegedly, someone had seen Anne and George warmly chatting to each other, which they believed was uncharacteristic of a sibling. The evidence of the alleged plot on Henry's life was compiled, literally, on their knees. Evidence was shown in court allegedly showing the conspirators, including the Queen, met to devise a plan to assassinate the king at Westminster on October 30, 1535, and January 8, 1536, while the Queen was at Windsor in October and at Eltham in January. Interestingly, these machinations and tampering with evidence did not escape public attention and caused discontent even among those who were enemies of Anne Boleyn. An indignant member of the Spanish Parliament, who could not forget Anne's injustice to Catherine, wrote in a letter that both the men and the accused herself had been condemned on the basis of conjecture and some hints, without convincing evidence or admission of guilt. Anna behaved honorably, steadfastly denying all charges, whether accusations of conspiracy or accusations of infidelity. She knew that according to the Treason Act passed by King Edward I, the Queen's adultery was considered high treason, for which she faced death by burning at the stake. All those accused at the trial, led by the Queen and her brother, were sentenced to death. Both Anne and her brother accepted the verdict of the trial with humility and calmness. The accused also made a short speech in which she said, "I do not claim that I have always treated the king with proper humility, considering the great kindness and respect he has shown me, and I also admit that I have often been jealous of him, but let God be my witness that I have been guilty of nothing else." Perhaps the Queen thought that humility and stoic calm would somehow miraculously save her from the scaffold. The 5 condemned men, including George Boleyn, were beheaded on May 17 after the verdict was announced. Even her longtime ally, Archbishop Cranmer, was afraid to speak out in defense of the wrongfully convicted Queen, stating in a letter to Henry VIII that no woman has ever enjoyed a better reputation in my eyes than Anne Boleyn, therefore I hold her to be innocent, but immediately added it. Think, however, that since your Majesty intends to punish her, her guilt is not in doubt. Anne Boleyn was completely dependent on the king's favor. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, she was not a princess or a close relative of European royalty. Anne Boleyn found herself defenseless. As already mentioned, the punishment for women guilty of treason was death at the stake. However, Anne was spared the horrible torment at the stake. As a sign of mercy, the king brought to her a master of his trade, a French executioner from Calais, who was extremely skillful and quick in beheading the condemned. Anne, on learning of the executioner who was to take her life, even expressed her joy that her beautiful neck would have to deal with so eminent an expert. The steward in the tower was completely stunned by the Queen's behavior, although in his life he had seen many people in the cell sentenced to death. According to him, they all awaited the end of their lives in deep sorrow, while Anne found much joy and pleasure in connection with death. Henry took care that Anne should not die queen. Before her death, he stripped her of that title. Their marriage was also annulled, making little Elizabeth illegitimate. Anne's execution was scheduled for May 19, 1536. Reconciled to her fate, Anne spent the night before her execution in prayer, called her priest at 2 o'clock in the morning, and received her last communion. Then she demonstrated her wit one last time by telling him to give the king a message from her. She said, "Thank the king so much for still continuing to elevate me. First he made me a marquess, then a queen, and now, seeing that he can no longer elevate me on earth, he is sending me to heaven to become a saint." Anne already wished it would be over sooner. She was told, "Madam, there will be no pain, because the stroke will be very quick." On the morning of May 19, the unfortunate Anne was escorted to the place of execution. She was accompanied by 4 court ladies. Anne still hoped that by some miracle she would be kept alive, that at the last moment her former husband, who once loved her so much, would finally send a messenger with a pardon, and she would be imprisoned at least in a convent. When Henry's second wife realized that her final hour had come, she made a short speech. Then the ladies of the court helped her remove her ermine coat and hat, after which Anne put a modest linen cap on her head, under which she hid her luxuriant black hair, and knelt down. One of the women blindfolded her, and the executioner, brought from Calais, proved to be truly a master of execution. In accordance with his instructions, the sword was hidden in a pile of hay lying nearby. While Anne was kneeling, her torturer shouted for the sword to be brought. Thereupon the condemned woman instinctively turned her head in that direction, and the man struck a swift blow. The head, separated from the body, was wrapped in white linen and buried with the body in St. Peter's Chapel, where Anne rests to this day. She was queen for 3 years. Just 11 days after Anne Boleyn's death, the monarch married Jane Seymour, who bore him his long-awaited son Edward. In 1547, his short reign as King Edward VI began, just 6 years. But he was not the true successor to Henry VIII, nor was he destined to turn England into a real power. That was to be done by his half-sister, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, executed in the Tower on May 19, 1536, Elizabeth I, who ascended the throne on November 17, 1558.